the settings, but the sounds, but now I can. So anyway, guys, hello, welcome to the PiG Daily, episode number 71. Today we're doing a beginner basics episode, which should also be useful for some more experienced players, where we talk about understanding upgrades. And this is a series where I'm going to go through and talk about all the most powerful upgrades, why they're relevant, how to calculate and figure out which upgrades are most important, since there are literally innumerable situations in StarCraft 2 where units can interact in different ways, and the upgrades can matter in different circumstances. So I'm going to do a series of videos going through matchup by matchup and talking about the most important upgrades in that specific matchup. So today we're going to start out with Zerg versus Zerg, and we're going to dive straight in game, and I'm going to show you guys how to test this out and how to figure out stuff for yourself. So first of all, click Arcade, and up here in the top right, you want to type in lot of unit tester. My favorite one is this second one that shows up for me. It's made by Brandon, and it has a 5-star rating across 80 ratings there. Thanks, Brandon. I've never met someone in Australia called Brandon. I think Puck is the only person I know called Brandon. So you don't need an opponent. You don't need to mess around with anything. Just click Start Game once you're in there. And yeah, you can hop into this. This is a unit tester. This is a great place to practice your micro. First of all, go to Terrain and click Field, so you get a bit more area to work with. And then you can just click through these tabs and you can actually control both sides. So we're doing Zerg versus Zerg at the start. And let's start out talking about the most important units, which are going to be Zerglings. Now, before I start talking too much about exactly what upgrades do what and how they scale, now what we're going to be talking about today is a few concepts in terms of how we calculate these upgrades. Some of them are basically effective damage and effective survivability in relevant scenarios, in common scenarios. What does that mean? What it means is how many hits it takes your units to die in a common scenario. And this is one of the best ways to calculate these real power points where an upgrade works out really well. Is you start to calculate at what point does an upgrade suddenly take it from, say, 7 hits for a unit to kill another unit down to 5 hits. That's a really big boost. Whereas just because an upgrade gives a raw, say, 20% damage boost, it won't always, when in the common battle where that unit's fighting another unit, it might not necessarily make you kill that unit 20% faster. So what we actually want to calculate here is how much does it increase the effective damage in these common scenarios, and also, likewise, carapace upgrades, how much do they increase the effective survivability? How many more hits does it take you to die per armor upgrade? So let's take a look at some of these Zergling upgrades. Now, keep in mind, with your upgrades, a general rule which people like to say is that an attack upgrade, I've just given +1 melee and +1 carapace. An attack upgrade, they say, gives about 10% damage per upgrade. And a carapace upgrade always just gives 1 point of armor, no matter what unit it is. Now, in this case, a Zergling starts with just 5 damage, like this little guy on the right who has no upgrades, but the upgrade still gives it a full point of damage. So in this case, it's actually a 20% boost. So with Zerglings, it's actually quite a lot bigger because they're this low damage unit. However, usually you do only get about a 10% boost. Sometimes it varies though. Some units get about 10, some units get like 15%. It kind of varies from unit to unit, but carapace is always just 1 point of armor, which obviously just blocks 1 damage. It's not like you suddenly get a percentage or anything like that worked in Warcraft. So as a result, armor is very good against low damage attacks, but getting a single point of armor, say, against a siege tank shot doesn't really matter because you're still going to take 49 damage to the face rather than 50. So anyway, let's take a look at Zergling interactions and see just how important these upgrades are. So let's go back to 0, 0 upgrades, and we can test this out. This is the most basic scenario. We can say Zergling versus Zergling. How long does it take a Zergling to kill another one? 3, 4, 5, 6. It's going to take 8 hits for a Zergling to kill another Zergling. And you can see the Zergling survives with just 1 hit. 1 little tiny bit of life if it does only take 7 hits. So if we then give +1 melee to one of those Zerglings, how much is that going to change the scenario? Let's take a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. takes it from 8 down to 7 attacks. Now, this is actually where things get a little bit interesting, though. That is variable. And this is where stuff gets weird, because I sat here yesterday testing this for a while, and there's kind of a random delay in terms of when units attack, and sometimes one unit attacks faster than the other. So let's check that scenario about 5 more times in a row, and let's see what happens. Now remember, it went from 8 hits to 7 hits with +1. Is that actually consistent, though? Check this out. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6. Whoa, 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 whoa. Wait a second. It took 7 hits on the previous try. Why did it take 6 hits this time? This is what we call the mystery of StarCraft. It's very hard to actually recognize exactly what happened there. But if I recreate the situation one more time, I'm going to try and catch it in motion. Try and catch it in motion. And I can't guarantee it's going to happen. It might take 7, it might take 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I believe the difference is, well, I know the difference is, sometimes there will be just a tiny bit of extra delay, which will allow that Zergling, you see how it survived there? It had like the tiniest sliver of life and required 1 more hit. Throughout the course of that engagement, the Zergling just had that extra moment to regenerate a 2nd hit point of life. So this is something that's important. Life regeneration in Zerg versus Zerg battles, and it's what kind of complicates any calculation of damage attack upgrades against Zerg. The longer a battle draws out, the more regeneration kicks in. And this gets even more complicated when you add in Mutalisks, which regenerate at like 20 times faster than any other unit. So it can get a little bit complicated there. Now, if you've got 2 Zerglings with +1 hitting that Zergling, it's always going to take 6 hits because they're going to kill it faster. It's never going to get the time. So each Zergling will just hit it 3 times, it'll go down. However, in a one-on-one Zergling fight, about half the time, that Zergling will take 7 hits rather than 6. So +1 melee, if you don't actually kind of outnumber your opponent in Zerglings and you're not dishing out like multiple damage to their individual Zerglings, if it's an equal battle line of Zerglings versus Zerglings, sometimes you're going to get the full 25% boost of going from 8 hits down to 6 hits, and sometimes you're only going to get the 12.5% boost from 8 hits down to 7 hits. And that's kind of interesting there. It's just kind of by chance how long those Zerglings are going to take to kill each other. Carapace, on the other hand, is always going to be a little bit more reliable because it's going to cause that that hit count to always go up. So check this out. This time we've got a Carapace Zergling versus a non-Carapace Zergling. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And he's always going to survive that. Well, that should have been 9 hits to kill him, I believe. Actually, let me double check that. Let's do that again. It took 10 hits there, rather than 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Whoa. Whoa, was that 11? Shouldn't have been 11 hits. Let's check that one more time. I don't know if I'm counting wrong, because it definitely was not like that in the first scenario. And I'm pretty sure I just counted wrong there. So we're going to double check, though. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 hits, yeah. So it's going to always take 10 hits, as long as it's kind of Zergling to Zergling to kill the Carapaceling. No matter what, as long as it, as long as it continues like that. So Carapace is actually more reliable than +1 melee in your early Zergling battles. However, as long as if you're doing, say, a big Zergling all-in with +1 melee, and you're just kind of already outnumber his lings, so you're going to have more Zerglings fighting his anyway. The fight's going to be very sudden and fast. It's going to be just as worthwhile. And of course, +1 melee is cheaper. It costs 50 less gas, 50 less minerals. So it's always going to be a little bit of the more accessible upgrade there, which people prefer. Carapace has other benefits we'll talk about in just a little bit, though. So you can see here what we kind of start doing is you start calculating how many hits, where those upgrades really give you that power. And Especially why is this first melee or this first carapace upgrade so important? I want to go home back and I just want to rub that home one more time. So let's go back to Zerg versus Zerg, no upgrades, Zergling versus Zergling. And the reason is overkill. Remember that in a 0-0 versus 0-0 situation, there is a lot of overkill. What I'm talking about is that Zergling survives on 1 hit point, which means the next hit that needs to finish it off is effectively doing 4 points of bonus damage, which it doesn't need. So suddenly, when you add an extra damage throughout, you're not only adding that damage across each hit during that fight, but you've also got those 4 bonus points of damage, which can add on top of those bonus damage, and it kind of like rolls over, and then you can suddenly knock 2 hits off your overall number of hits required to kill the opponent. That's how you identify where these sort of strengths lie in your upgrades. So that's something which is kind of general. You can apply to any matchup if you want to go investigate upgrades in certain situations on your own. In terms of Zergling speed, guys, let's just very quickly continue giving our overview of the Zergling. Zergling speed is one of the most important upgrades in the game. It is absolutely ridiculous, the move speed upgrade. It takes you from 4.13 movement speed, a regular Zergling, up to 6.58. Now that might seem like an arbitrary number if you're newer to the game, but you can just see how much of an increase that is. And to calculate, that is a 59% movement speed increase. It is absolutely massive. So this Zergling can literally run circles around the other Zerglings. It's the biggest movement speed upgrade you get from any upgrade in the game. And also keep in mind, guys, that creep will give all of your units roughly a 30% movement speed increase as well. 6.58 plus 1.97. With the exception of Hydras, who have the movement speed upgrade, who will not get a movement speed upgrade on creep, and Queens, who actually get a much bigger than 30% movement speed upgrade when they're on creep, since they are obscenely slow off creep. So movement speed is very important. You can see why is movement speed so damn important for melee units? Well, they need to actually close the distance to engage in hand-to-hand. And that's why Zerglings without Zergling speed, you'll often see them in these ineffective scenarios just kind of trying to derp around. They're trying to get at a bunch of Marines and they're all just like dying and they like can't really wrap around them. They just can't make contact with the enemy units. Zerglings, Banelings, Ultras, all these units, it's so important to be able to close with your opponent, and just generally, even things like Roaches, which are quite close range units. The Zerg army is a lot about closing with the opponent. That's why creep is so damn important. That's why movement speed upgrades are so damn important. So your units can actually swarm on top of their army, get on top and deal the damage that needs to be done. All right. Yeah. By the way, guys, with the whole carapace thing, because carapace always drags the fight longer, just to clarify something in my notes, which I'm not sure I said clearly, when you've got a Zergling with carapace, part of the reason it always takes the 10 hits is because it takes it from 8 hits to 9 hits to die. It means it always consistently buys that extra time in the battle. So unless it's like your Zerglings are surrounded and getting focused down, they will always survive long enough from when the damage starts to get that second hit point of regen, which is what really boosts them up. Keep in mind as well, guys, I'll show you guys just some of my very basic math so you can see how I calculate this stuff. You can see I do things like this here, where I go 36 divided by 4. So what I've done there, this is calculating carapace Zerglings, for instance, right? So what you do is you always take the hit points of the actual Zergling itself, or the Zerg unit itself, and then you go +1. Actually, I wrote it down better up here. So here, calculating how many units it takes to kill another unit in a common interaction is a good way to see how much value it gives. In Ling versus Ling, for instance, we do the hit points of the unit +1 divided by the attack of the unit. Now, why is it +1? It's because literally the moment a unit takes damage, a Zerg unit will instantly regenerate. So unless it gets killed in that one shot, it will always effectively have one more hit point, and then potentially, depending on how long it takes to die, it might add a few more hit points of regen throughout. So just to clarify that, make sure I'm actually filling you guys in on all my notes while I go, because I spent hours and hours just sitting there testing units in the tester yesterday, and I'm like, I need to tell you guys the information now. I don't want to spend my Sunday afternoon doing that for naught, and then just forget to hand over all the important info. So So what I did end up deciding there is that in Zergling versus Zergling, Carapace is usually the more powerful ability in terms of reliability, but it is more expensive. You've got to remember it does cost 150 gas, 150 minerals, as opposed to 100, 100. But it doesn't help you deal more damage. If you think about the function of Zerglings, often they're doing run-bys, they're running in to kill workers, they're running into, attack your opponent's economy, kill buildings. In that scenario, melee is always going to be more effective because when you're fighting where your opponent isn't, it's not about survivability, it's about doing the damage as fast as possible. That's going to be the most important thing you can possibly do. Final Zergling thing to talk about is going to be Adrenal Glands, of course. The most ridiculous upgrade in the game. It is absolutely insane. So let's get some Adrenal Gland. 0-0 Adrenal Gland Zergling versus a Zergling who doesn't have Adrenal Glands. Now, Adrenal Glands gives a 40% attack boost, going up from attacking twice a second to almost attacking 3 times a second. It is absolutely huge. Now, what you've got to remember, though, is once again, the Zergling needs to actually be making contact to get that to work, and it is a hive tech upgrade, but it's always one of the most value upgrades at just 200 minerals, 200 gas. The real thing which makes it powerful, though, is in this scenario, you might be like, oh yeah, that's cool, the one Zergling wins. He wins by a bit more than he would, or about the same as he would with +1 melee. But you've got to remember that this stacks with your melee upgrades. If you suddenly add +3 melee, it's taking a Zergling's attack from 5 up to 8, and then you're adding 40% attack speed. So check this out. Even without Carapace upgrades, this +3 melee Adrenal Gland Zergling is going to do pretty well against these 2 Zerglings. Like, actually kills one of them really fast. If we reset, we could probably do, what, like 3 Zerglings versus 5 Zerglings. Let's see how that works out. I haven't tested this before, but I'm pretty sure the 5 Zerglings will only barely win. Oh, they don't even win. The 3 Zerglings win. Like, it's just insane. So every upgrade you get scales with an attack speed boost, which is why Adrenal Glands is so insane. Of course, the reason Zerglings can get such insane upgrades that give 20% damage on that first upgrade, of course, it's not quite 20% after that per upgrade, but it's still a very big jump per attack, and then give them 40% attack speed on top of that, is because of the way Zerglings function in StarCraft. As the game goes on, they simply can't find the surface area to effectively do damage. Even in Zerg vs. Zerg, you're going to start to run into situations like this, where even if you've got +2 melee Zerglings, the Roaches start to get +1 range. The Roaches start to get, in this awesome scenario, where they all kind of cover each other's backs. And you can see stuff like this. Like, let's see, you got like a squad of Roaches, and it's like, yeah, these Adrenal Gland Zerglings are nice and awesome, right? But because the Roaches all have +1 attack, they start to 2-shot Zerglings. The Zerglings struggle to actually, whittle down the Roaches. And even though the Zerglings there had way better upgrade than these shitty +1 Roaches, almost all of those Zerglings died. So that brings us on to Ling vs. Roach. Let's talk about that. So let's get rid of all the upgrades again, and let's talk about that interaction from scratch, because actually right there those Zerglings did pretty well, didn't they? If you give them Adrenal and +3 melee, Zerglings turn out to be a pretty good unit. So let's talk about Zerglings versus Roaches. We can start out with like 3 Zerglings fighting a Roach. Now it takes 37 hits for a normal Zergling to kill a Roach with no upgrades. That's even if over the course of the battle the Roach regenerates about 3 hit points. If the Roach regenerates 4 hit points, then it'll take it up to 38 Zergling hits. So if the fight really drags out, it'll go up to that. But in a fight like that, it only really regenerates, 2 or 3. Now, suddenly if you get +1 melee, that's going to go up pretty drastically. That's only going to be 30 hits rather than 37. Because suddenly the Zerglings are negating that single point of armor the Roach has, and we can see just how much more effective they were. We add +2, and it goes from 30 hits down to 25 hits. And 3 Zerglings are just going to decimate this Roach so quickly. He only barely kills 1 Zergling. So these upgrades end up really good. The big danger, of course, is the Roach upgrades, which is, as soon as Roaches get +1, This is a huge power upgrade though. You know, those, it's like, okay, yeah, that makes a good difference, but suddenly, as soon as the Roach gets +1, rather than taking 3 shots to kill a Zergling, you can see he only takes 2 shots, and he starts to rip through these Zerglings 33% faster. And this is one of these points where it's like, yeah, it goes from this number of hits to this number of hits. That's nice. This number of hits to this number of hits. But suddenly going from 3 hits to 2 hits with a single upgrade is a 33% boost. That is insane. That is a massive one. So +1 range in Roach vs Zergling is one of the most important upgrades in the game. It's absolutely massive. However, what you've got to keep in mind there is counter upgrades. So whenever you identify one of these big booms, and like I said earlier in Zergling vs Zergling, it didn't matter because Carapace and Melee would cancel each other out. However, now when we're looking at a unit with a bigger damage like the Roach actually gets +2 per attack. It goes from 16 to 18. So I've given it +1, but notice now I've given these Zerglings +1 Carapace, and it brings it back to 3 shots. So a single Carapace upgrade will negate all of the effectiveness of the +1 range. Zerglings suddenly, against +1 Roaches, become just as effective as they were before. However, once +2 range kicks in, suddenly that Carapace upgrade effectively does nothing. It literally is worth 0 in Roach vs Zergling. And this is where you start to identify where upgrades are worthwhile and where they're not worthwhile. So that Carapace upgrade, even if they were 0 Carapace Zerglings, they would still die in 2 shots. What about if we give them +3 Carapace? At that point, will it make a difference? And this really is the only point where it'll make a difference. At +2, they would still die. At +3, they just barely survive. But once the Roach gets +3 as well, this is where, even with +3 Carapace, you're not going to have a happy time. Your Zergling is always going to get 2-shotted. And this is a situation you'll often find. So what you'll find usually is with a certain attack upgrade and a certain interaction, you get a big boost in effectiveness. At your opponent's point of armor upgrades, there'll be a certain point where they negate that boost. But then usually if you go up 1 more notch of attack upgrades, or sometimes 2 notches, no matter how many Carapace upgrades they get, they can never keep up. And that's simply because with each Carapace upgrade, you're only getting an extra point of armor, whereas every time these Roaches get an attack upgrade, they get +2 attack. So at this point, it's +6 attack versus just +3 armor. It doesn't matter. The +3 armor becomes completely negligible. All right, guys, let's zoom through the other units now and just kind of go through what's important with them, because I'm just kind of blabbering now. I've talked about the most important things and how you guys can calculate this and figure it out yourselves, but let's go through the other important ones. So, reset. Whoops. Banelings. Banelings will always one-shot Zerglings. However, if the Zergling has +1 Carapace, then suddenly these Zerglings will survive on 1 hit point. So that's a very important upgrade, is +1 Carapace versus Banelings. However, if you give the Banelings +1 melee, your Carapace is worth crap. It's worth nothing. Pretty rare to have +1 melee Banelings, but it does happen on occasion. That's because they're going to be doing 39 damage. So even if you got +3 Carapace on these Zerglings, they'd only have a total of 38. They'd still be getting one-shot by those Banelings. So once you get +1 melee, there's no way for your Zerglings to survive any longer against those. As for themselves, excuse me, the Banelings will die quite a bit faster as you get melee upgrades. When it comes to a Zergling trying to knock down a Baneling before it gets into a mineral line, it starts off at 7 hits, and it goes up by 1 hit with every melee upgrade. 6 hits, 5 hits, and so on. The only other interesting interaction is going to be versus Hydralisks, where what you'll see is at 0-0, it's going to take 3 Banelings to kill a Hydra. However, if we add +1 melee, it's only going to take 2 Banelings. Oh, no, sorry, +2 melee is where that happens. So in the very rare situation that you play a very heavily upgraded Ling style after your Mutalisks or while going Mutas, there's a point only at +2 melee where you start to two-shot Hydralisks and become more effective against them. However, if the Hydras, in the very rare situation they have +3 armor, it's going to take +3 melee in order to two-shot them. Very niche situation, but something that's worth talking about. Of course, guys, oh, back on, actually, where did my... Oh, here we go. Cool. Yep. Of course, Baneling speed only gives an 18% movement speed increase, much slower than all the other movement speed increases, such as Roach speed and Zergling speed. However, because it is a suicide unit, every single time you do get Banelings, and this was a question from Twitter, it said, when do you want to get Baneling speed? Every time that you're using Banelings as a key part of your composition in the mid-game. If you just make a few Banelings in the early game, say in Zerg versus Zerg, you do not want to be just sticking with Banelings. Like, there's no point, if you're like making Roaches or Mutas, there's no point in making Banelings, right? So usually we don't see Banelings in the mid-game of Zerg vs Zerg. The only scenario where we do see Banelings in the mid-game of Zerg vs Zerg is when a player, say, goes Hydralisks to counter your Mutalisks. If you've gone Mutas, your opponent goes Hydras, then you can add in Speed Banelings specifically to blow up those Hydralisks so that your Mutas can just kill everything else. Let's talk about Roaches now. So Roach versus Roach, you'll often hear people say that +2 range is the most important Roach upgrade. I'm trying to remember if there's some magical reason for this, because in all my testing, it really didn't matter. There was no difference between it and any other upgrade. When you have unupgraded Roaches versus unupgraded Roaches, it is going to take you... Where are my notes? Where are my notes on this? There they are. So it is going to take you 10 hits at base to kill another Roach. Let's reset and check that one more time. That was a double KO. Wow. So 10 hits, guys. 1, 2, 3, 4, occasionally 11. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It says occasionally 11 in my notes because very occasionally, like in that first fight, they will just kind of regenerate a bit more, I believe. However, you add +1, it takes it down to 9 hits. It's just very linear, it's nothing massive. And then +2, it takes it down to 8 hits. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The real reason that +1 range is so important is because it negates the early Zerglings that your opponent might have committed to so much. So +1 range, while it's helpful in Roach battles, it definitely is. Taking it down from 10 hits to 9 hits, that's a boost. That's nice. That's a bit over, well, that's about a 10% increase. Like, that's pretty nice. That's awesome. But it's not massive. It's not like those Zerglings, you know, with their first upgrade where they just totally destroy the other Zerglings. It's a small boost, but the big thing is it's a 33% boost against any enemy Zerglings from the early game. So if your opponent lingers on Zerglings, if they've gone, say, Muta Zerglings, suddenly the Zerglings on the ground are very weak against the Roaches. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Now, a lot of people always go on about +2, and this is something I'd never tested throughout all my time playing StarCraft 2, but everyone said +2 is the important upgrade in Roach battles. They said +2 is where you get a really big power spike. However, mathematically, it doesn't actually do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 10 hits, 9 hits, 8 hits. Obviously going from 9 to 8 is a bit better than 10 to 9. It does make a little bit of a better difference, but it's really percentage-wise not that much of a difference. So realistically, it's really not that big of a problem, not that big of a difference whatsoever. Now, if you're still having a one-on-one Roach battle, even when you get +3 range, you're still going to take 8 hits. So +3 is actually not very important compared to +2. However, because in big battles, there's usually going to be a bit less regen, the +3 will normally tick over and end up being 7 hits. So usually in a big battle, +3 is still going to be effective, but in small skirmishes, +3, not nearly as important as +1 or +2. Okay, cool. Also, of course, guys, Ravages. We don't need to talk much about Ravages, and the reason is Ravages have the same attack as a Roach. So everything applies the same way as a Roach's attack does. The only difference is Ravages attack from a little bit further away and they attack a bit faster. In terms of their lower life, that definitely does change calculations. The thing is, Ravages are never meant to be fighting on their own. They're never meant to be in the front line. They're kind of like a spellcaster that sits behind the Roaches. So calculating complex interactions of how much damage kills them is one of the least important and most superfluous things to do, so we're not going to bother with it. So that doesn't really make too much sense. Now, here's where we get some interesting interactions, and this is something which counts more in other matchups, not so much in Zerg vs. Zerg, but we are going to talk about Queens, and Queens are exceptionally interesting, and the reason they're so interesting is because they have 2 attacks. And now this is something which is very fascinating, because it means that things get weird. So, when you've got 2 attacks, armor modifiers will hit you twice. So, because they've only got 4 damage in attack and they get a full damage point for each attack upgrade, their attacks actually really benefit from these attack upgrades, like a lot. Like if I had +1 here, that Queen versus this Zergling, this actually goes from 5-shotting a Zergling to 4-shotting a Zergling. Like that's pretty sick. Look how fast that Ling dies. That's pretty sick. That's pretty damn awesome. That's a 20% boost there. You get +2. And it's going to be an even bigger boost. It's going to 3-shot the Zergling now. Like, holy crap. That's sick. That's sick. However, let's go back to 0-0. What about if you don't have range upgrades? Remember, Carapace, any armor whatsoever. Remember, a Zergling starts with 0 armor, which is why the Queens are so effective against them. But as soon as you start adding units with base armor like Roaches, or you get Carapace upgrades, suddenly there is an amplified effect because that armor affects both of the 4 damage attacks, effectively dropping your damage there by 25%. That's a 25% decrease. And that actually goes, with just +1 Carapace, from 5-shotting Zerglings to 7-shotting the Zerglings. Now let's add +2 Carapace. And if you guys ever wondered what impotency feels like, that's what this Queen is feeling right now. It's like, hey, I'm gonna kill you, you little bitch. What the? Why don't you die? Die! And it takes 10 hits to kill it. Don't even get me started on +3 Carapace Zerglings versus Queens. This is the funniest thing ever. Keep in mind, this interaction carries over to fighting Zealots with Zerglings. Oh, fighting Zealots, any 2 attack units, same with Marauders, if they have less attack upgrades than you have armor upgrades, they start to just become so weak. Look at this Queen, it almost loses to a +3 Carapace Zergling. Like, it takes so much damage, it takes so long to clear it out. So, if you ever fall behind in attack upgrades with a double attack unit against their Carapace upgrades, like, it just becomes so disgustingly bad. Now, that's also part of why Carapace attacks are so big in Zerg vs. Zerg. They used to be. Big Roachling Carapace attacks. There's 2 reasons. So we've talked about a bunch of the interactions here. So in the early game, well, Carapace basically means Queens just suck against Zerglings. It takes it from 5-shotting Zerglings to 7-shotting them. Like, that's a big boost to their survivability. But we also talked about how Roaches, once they get +1 range, they can 2-shot Zergling. So if you're playing someone who's taking up to +1 Roaches, trying to take a 3rd, and then you do this big Roachling or Ravagerling all in, and you've got a Carapace upgrade, the Carapace will completely negate that +1 range, allowing your Zerglings to still have good value. So Carapace is going to be good versus the Queens. It's going to be good versus any +1 Roaches. It's going to be fantastic as well versus any unupgraded Zerglings or drones they have. So this is why Carapace is a really big one when you're doing those big all-in assaults, because it's just so useful against all those early defensive units. Okay, guys, going to finish up very quickly. There are a few other scenarios. I can't believe I went so long with this. I'm going through literally every different type of unit. Oh my god. I should have planned this one a bit better, but that's all right. I mean, this is going to be one of those detailed episodes for someone who wants to know every single thing about ZvZ upgrades, I guess. Okay, Roach speed. Very simple. It just gives you a nice boost. Really important. It's a movement speed boost of... So this is the Roach speed one, that's the one without. It's a movement speed increase of 25%, up from 3.15 to 4.2. Very nice upgrade once again that hits at Lair Tech. As always, these sort of upgrades, you always want to get them whenever you're using more than a few of these units in your army composition. If they're ever a significant part of your army, you always want to be getting Baneling speed, Zergling speed, Roach speed. They're so damn important. Alright guys, let's talk about the only important upgrade in Lurker versus Roach, which is your +1 attack as well. So if you just have a regular Lurker, no attack upgrades, it is going to 6-shot a Roach. However, once you get +1 attack, it will 5-shot those Roaches. We see here it just barely doesn't kill it until the 6th shot. You add +1 range, and you are absolutely always going to be 5-shotting those Roaches until they get +3 carapace, which is not something which kicks in very often. So only if that Roach gets +3 carapace can it actually force you to need +2 in order to keep that 5-shot boost. So just +1 range is really the only important upgrade on Lurkers. So if you're going Lurkers after, say, Mutalisks, you don't have any ground upgrades yet, just go for that +1 range with them. And that's going to help you cleave through those Roaches with a nice big increase in efficiency there. Also, with Hydras, Lurkers versus Hydras, this is still a +1 Lurker. What you'll find is that normally it will take 3 shots. Normally it will take 5 shots. But when you get +1, you start to 4-shot Hydralisks. The only way they can negate that is by getting +2 carapace or above to keep it at 5 shots until the Lurker's +2 attack kicks in, at which point Hydras will always be killed in 4 shots. Alright, Ultralisk time. And this is where it gets fun. Ultralisks are just a hilarious unit. So guys, what upgrades are actually important with Ultralisks? Obviously, chitinous plating, the one that gives them +4 armor, is very important. And when you're fighting Ultra versus Ultra, every single upgrade matters, but it's really those attack upgrades which matter the most. Ultras will always kill Zerglings in... let's actually do Ultra versus Zergling to start out. So, Ultras will always kill a Zergling in 1 shot at the beginning of the game, if the Zergling has no armor upgrades. Bam! 1 shot, no chance to regen. However, if that Zergling has carapace, you are going to need +1 melee. Once you have +1 melee, you will always 1-shot the Zergling, rather than having it be annoying and force you to take 2 shots. So even if you've got +3 carapace, you get +1 melee, Zerglings are useless. They're toast. They're going to die in 1 shot every single time. So +1 melee, very important. Also something which is important against Marauders and Marines, but we're going to talk about that in a different episode. It'll also against Roaches. Let's talk about that. So here we've got an unupgraded one against a Roach. Now, an Ultralisk against a Roach is going to take 5 shots. However, when you get +1, it's going to go down to 4 shots. And then it's always going to be at 4 shots. So once again, +1 melee is always the most important upgrade when it comes to Ultralisks. That +1 melee is so absolutely vital against all the basic units here. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it really does help. +2, you're still going to 4-shot a Roach. +3, you're still going to 4-shot a Roach. Carapace will not affect your unupgraded Ultras at all. Carapace will negate +1. So if this Roach gets +1 carapace, what we'll find here is, okay, if he's got +1 carapace, you will need +2. But once you've got +2, nothing negates +2. You see, he survives with just a tiny bit. So +1 melee and +2 melee are the most important upgrades for those Ultralisks. Likewise, against Hydralisks, you're going to 3-shot Hydralisks until you get +2 melee. However, if he gets carapace, you're then going to need to get +3 melee in order to 2-shot them. So all the upgrades kind of help against those. Ultras versus Lurkers, you're going to kill them in 6 hits. You'll only at +3 5-shot Lurkers. So only once you get +3 does that help against Lurkers. Ultra versus Ultra, it's 17 hits normally. If you get +1, it becomes 16 hits. Here we go. So it's like not that big in Ultra vs Ultra. Like it's not like absolutely crazy in terms of the number of hits, but simply because Ultra vs Ultra, these are the only units which are really valuable in that situation, it ends up making enough of a difference to be huge. So you see there, the +1 melee takes it from 17 hits to 16 hits. With +2 melee in an if you don't have armor upgrades, that's where it starts to become much more important though. You get a nice power spike. If your opponent doesn't have armor upgrades, this is meant to be with chitinous plating to show this. Whoops. There we go. Because you're always going to have chitinous plating in any sort of Ultralisk fight. I tested it all with chitinous plating, so everything I've said is correct. But once you get +2 melee, that suddenly drops down to just 14 shots, which is actually pretty big. Pretty damn big. So all of your upgrades do count a lot, but +1 carapace will help negate that and push it up 1 shot as well. Finally, let's finish up, guys, because I have blabbered on about so many different things. Let's talk about Muta vs Muta. There's no crazy important upgrades in terms of the ultras and so on, but when it comes to mutas, it's very important which upgrades you get. Carapace is always worth a lot more than attack. These Mutalisks on the left, it's 5 Mutalisks versus 5 Mutalisks. I'm just going to A-move them. Obviously, it's not a perfect test scenario, but the guys on the right, they're the ones with +1 range, +1 attack. The guys on the left are the ones with Carapace. The ones on the left are going to win, and the reason for this is because the way a Mutalisk's attack works is it does 9, or in this case 10 damage with the upgrade, but then it bounces around, as you can see here. Let's watch that one more time. Let's just have 3 mutas kind of flying around, and we're going to watch the 1 muta come and attack them. And you're going to see it actually bounces around. Notice how they're all taking damage, even though he's only shooting the 1. The way that damage works is the Mutalisk does 9 damage to the first target, and then 1/3 to each target after. So it's 9 damage, 3 damage, 1 damage. So when you get an attack upgrade, you get 9 goes up to 10 on the first bounce, but then the second bounce only gets 0.3 of a damage because it only gets 1/3 of that upgrade. The third bounce only gets 0.11 repeater of a bounce of the damage point because it is only on the third bounce. Carapace, on the other hand, if we fly these 3 mutas around, that carapace is going to reduce every single bounce by 1, which means the bounces become very ineffective. And only really that first Mutalisk starts taking significant damage. So in Muta vs Muta, you absolutely always want to be going for those Carapace upgrades first, and that becomes very important. Now when it comes to attack upgrades and calculating exactly how many hits it takes to kill another Mutalisk, it's unimportant, it's completely pointless. The reason is because mutas regenerate at 1.4 hit points a second, 1,000 times faster than any other unit. It always changes how many hits it's going to take to kill a Mutalisk depending on focus fire, depending on how many Mutalisks are in a fight, and it's going to change drastically based on those circumstances. So as a general rule, you simply always want to go for Carapace upgrades before Flyer upgrades. Many players will go +2 Carapace before starting the Flyer upgrades, attack upgrades, even though they cost a lot more money. And that's something you always want to remember in regards to that. So guys, besides that, Infestor upgrade, you always want to remember that when I don't have a pathogen glands in the unit tester, but when you start your pathogen glands on your infestation pit, you want to let that get up to 21 seconds finished, which is 37.5%, and only then start your infestors, and that way they'll pop out just after the upgrade finishes, allowing you to be super efficient. So likewise, when it comes to something like that, that actually gives a starting bonus to the unit when it pops, you always want to make sure it pops out after the upgrade finishes. And finally, to finish up, as it already has been way longer than I meant to be this episode, when are upgrades worthwhile? Was a good question I had before I started the show. It said, sorry, not that one, but it says, if someone's doing an all-in, when are the upgrades worth getting? Like, if someone's attacking into you without upgrades, at what point is getting upgrades worthwhile? The general rule is upgrades are something which will help you survive to the later parts of the game. Sometimes you can get an upgrade and then try to kill your opponent, but it gives you strength at that point in the game. Usually before that, an upgrade gives you nothing. An upgrade is an investment which will not pay off for a certain amount of time. So every upgrade you get is kind of pushing you into a later stage of the game. It's giving you strength at a later point in the game. So every single time when it comes to do I get an upgrade or do I build units, it all comes down to exactly what your game plan is. There's so much complex interplay in terms of the situations that are going on, but there are certain upgrades which will give you such important boosts that, for instance, as I said, if you're just going to go for a Ravager Ling timing attack, but a sort of later one where your opponent often has +1 range, always get your +1 carapace to negate that +1 range. If you are going to be going into a heavy Roach style, you don't like to make Banelings, you're always going to need a fast +1 range attack, because otherwise they might just be able to swarm over you with Zerglings. But you get that +1 range, you can suddenly two-shot Zerglings. If you're playing Muta versus Muta, you always need that carapace upgrade, or your Mutas are going to scale much worse than theirs, because your bounces are going to be ineffective against their armor, whereas their bounces are going to be effective versus you. So every upgrade always depends on the situation a little bit. Do you invest in it? Do you not? If you're simply going all in right then, right now, well, there's no point starting an upgrade. You only start an upgrade, ahead of time to plan when you're going to attack or plan to defend at a later stage of the game. And that's generally how your upgrades work. So that is a series of, let's talk about every single aspect of Zerg vs. Zerg upgrades and the exact maths of how many units there is. Hopefully you guys got a good idea of exactly how many, where the big power ones are. The power ones are definitely Zerglings versus Zerglings. Upgrades are amazing, especially the very first upgrades. Adrenal gland scales insanely well if you've already upgraded the damage of your Zerglings. It just goes crazy. And as I said, Roach damage is very important for negating Zerglings. But in terms of Roach versus Roach, each upgrade is not really that much more important than the next. So don't get too hung up on that +2 range is the most important upgrade thing you'll hear people say. If someone does correct me on that, I would love them to, and I'll throw an annotation in the video to be like, actually, this is the reason why it's important. But I was just kind of sitting here yesterday testing it out, and I was like, I don't really see a massive boost there. It's like a very small incremental kind of increase compared to +1. So there's a couple of small questions in chat. In terms of Muta versus Muta, why would you go 1-1 before going for +2 carapace with Mutas? It's simply a cost thing. +2 carapace costs 225 minerals and 225 gas, and the +2 level upgrades always cost a lot more than the +1 level upgrades. So sometimes people say, I just can't spare that money right now, and I can't spare the time. I want to fight sooner. I want to fight right now. I want something that's cheaper. I want an extra Mutalisk right now. So if you go for +1 flyer attack after +1 carapace, rather than the +2 carapace, you're investing in the now. You want to have more mutas now to do damage or to defend or to harass your opponent's bases. Whereas if you're investing in +2 carapace, you're saying, I'm happy to wait and delay my power up a bit longer. I'm happy to invest more money into it and have one less Mutalisk now, because I know it's going to kick in later. So it all comes down to, play to the strengths of when your upgrade's going to kick in and that sort of thing. Another question here says, in what situations would you go double evolution chamber? It all comes down to your build and how you play. If you're playing double evolution chamber, usually you're playing a more macro late game oriented style. Certainly there are big timing attacks where you go for 1-1 upgrades, say with Roach Ravager, and then you just try to kill Terran. But if you're going to go for that big all-in attack and you're just going to throw everything at your opponent with no real transition behind that, there's no reason to start 2-2 as you move out. You just get the 1-1 and that's it. Likewise, if you want to hit an even faster, more committed timing, well, maybe you skip the carapace. You go single evolution chamber and you hit with +1 range. Generally speaking, if you're a very defensive player, you want to play to the later stages of the game, you want to play a macro game, that's when you always go kind of double evolution chamber or double engineering bay, and you want to continue that style of play. Of course, in Zerg vs. Zerg, if you do go double evolution chamber, the scary thing is that you get very committed to one style of tech. So you end up going for double melee upgrades, you're very stuck on that Zergling tech, any transition to Roaches becomes a bit awkward. If you're stuck on range carapace double upgrades, it makes it very awkward to then swap into Mutalisks because you've spent so much gas on your ground upgrades. It makes it very awkward to swap into Ultras because you've got so much time to catch up on those melee upgrades. So generally speaking, I personally always love single evolution chamber because it's more flexible in Zerg vs. Zerg, and I think tech switches and kind of adjusting in Zerg vs. Zerg and aggression is very important. However, some players love double evolution chamber styles, and that's definitely very worthwhile as well. Triple Helix says, would you skip pathogen glands? It seems quite popular recently. It all comes down to how many infestors you're building. If you're planning to build 5 or more infestors, you should always get pathogen glands. Whereas if you're like, I'm just going to get 2 infestors, that's it. I'm mainly focusing on getting my gas out for ultras. That's all I really want. Well, then it makes sense to say, well, why get an upgrade? Why not just build 2 infestors? Let them gather the energy anyway. They're going to have fungal around the same time. It won't really matter. But if you're building a lot of infestors and you're going to continue reinforcing infestors into your composition, then pathogen glands will always be worthwhile. A very good point as well is like, I talked here about the main power ones, but there's a lot of interactions which aren't common as well. So just to finish up, to answer Zerglord's question where he says, is it a good idea to research ground carapace against mutas? And that's something where actually carapace is amazing against mutas on the ground as well. So often you'll see a player who has mutas, the other guy has nothing that shoots up, and it seems really dire for him, but then he just runs across the map with 40 roaches with +2 carapace. And if the mutas, especially if they don't have +1 flyer attack, they are doing almost no damage. The bouncers literally will do nothing to the roaches, and the main attack is so reduced as well that the mutas simply can't kill the roaches fast enough, and the roaches can just run into the base, kill all the drones, kill all the hatcheries. So definitely, even though it's not something you often plan for, getting good carapace upgrades against mutas is fantastic. It really does limit their ability to damage your ground units. And that does make a big difference. So guys, let's finish up the show here. It's been a very long one. I'm going to try and really compress the following episodes. This was an experimental format, so when I look at the other matchups, it's definitely going to be much shortened. I'm going to try and keep it short and really only talk about the power upgrades and the concepts behind them. But for now, thank you very much for hanging out. I appreciate the questions, the interaction, and the support. Don't forget to hug a watermelon, kick a walrus, and of course, punch a walrus to the moon. I'll catch you guys next time. Goodbye and good night.